My parents told me that as a woman, I don't need money. But my sister? She deserves everything. Even if it means stealing my future to pay for her failures. I should have known. I should have realized years ago that in my parents' eyes, I was never really their daughter. I was just a backup plan, a resource to be used when needed. But nothing prepared me for the moment I opened my front door on that freezing December night and found two little kids shivering on my doorstep. Finn and Ivy. They had no coats, no gloves, just small suitcases, half empty, and wide, terrified eyes. And taped to Finn's tiny hand was a crumpled note. From my sister, Sienna. They're your problem now. I need to live my life. I stood there, my breath visible in the icy air, my heart pounding so hard I could barely think. This wasn't just about Sienna being irresponsible. This was about a lifetime of betrayal, a family that had used and discarded me like I was nothing, and a secret so horrifying that I almost didn't believe it myself. I posted my story on r/true off my chest, thinking I just needed to get it out. Thousands of strangers were outraged on my behalf, but what they didn't know was that the truth was so much worse. This is a real story, shared by SAVANNAH'S on r/true off my chest. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends. And if you want to hear more real, emotional stories like this, don't forget to follow Reddit True Vault. I grew up knowing my place. It wasn't something my parents ever explicitly said, but it was clear from the start. I was the child who had to sacrifice, and Sienna was the child who deserved everything. It had always been that way. Sienna was the golden child. Not because she was exceptionally smart or kind, but because she was born on a lucky day. A day that, according to my parents, brought prosperity to my father's business. From that moment on, she was treated like a blessing, like a sign from the universe that she was meant for great things. Me? I was just there. The expectations were different for each of us. At 5, I was doing chores, washing dishes, cleaning up after dinner, making my bed every morning with the kind of precision that was expected from an adult. Sienna, on the other hand, never lifted a finger. My mother would say she was too delicate for housework, as if cleaning up after herself would somehow damage her. At 13, I won a full academic scholarship to a prestigious high school. My teachers were thrilled. My guidance counselor said I had a bright future ahead of me. But when I came home, proud and eager to tell my parents, their reaction was lukewarm at best. "That's nice," my mother had said, barely looking up from her phone. My father just nodded, as if I had told him I'd taken out the trash. Meanwhile, when Sienna got a C+ on a math test, my parents took her out to dinner to celebrate her effort. At 16, I worked a part-time job at a local cafe, saving every dollar I could because I knew one thing for certain. No one was going to take care of me except me. Meanwhile, Sienna crashed her first car. My parents bought her another one the next day. I learned not to expect anything from them, until the day I was preparing for my final semester and needed the last payment for my tuition. Graduating from college was supposed to be my moment, my proof that I had made it on my own. I had spent 5 years pushing myself to the limit, balancing coursework, part-time jobs, and the crushing weight of knowing I had no safety net. While other students went home for the holidays, I worked double shifts. While they relaxed over summer break, I was scrubbing tables, answering phones, and barely sleeping just to keep myself afloat. I never complained. I never asked for help. I never looked back, because in the back of my mind, I still had something, my college fund. It had been set aside for me by my grandfather, a man who believed in education, who had always told me that I was meant for greater things. He had made sure there would be enough, not just to get me started, but to help me finish strong. I never touched it. Not once. It was meant to cover my final semester, my relocation expenses, and the beginning of my career. It was my safety net, the last thing connecting me to the family I had left behind. So when I sat across from my parents, my diploma almost within reach, I wasn't worried. I had done everything right. I had survived without them. I had proven my worth. But as I watched them exchange nervous glances, a pit formed in my stomach. Something was wrong. Then, my father cleared his throat. My mother shifted uncomfortably, and in that moment, before they even spoke, I knew something was gone. My grandfather's inheritance was supposed to be that push. The money he had left behind was meant for my education. Not for Sienna. Not for my parents. For me. I took a deep breath and asked about the money. The money that was meant for me. And that was when everything inside me collapsed. They had already spent it. Not on medical bills. Not on some emergency. No, on Sienna. On her wedding. Not her first. Not her second. Her third. I don't even remember what I said next. Maybe I screamed. Maybe I demanded to know how they could do this to me, how they could steal from me like this, how they could throw away my future like it meant nothing. But the worst part? They didn't even care. My mother just rolled her eyes. Like I was being dramatic. Like I was selfish for wanting what was mine. Sienna needed it more. That's all she said. And that's when I realized I was nothing to them. That night, I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like my entire life had been a lie. I had given them everything. My time, my love, my hard-earned money. Every ounce of energy I had ever poured into being the good daughter. The responsible one, the one who never complained, the one who always stepped aside so Sienna could shine. And for what? For nothing. Because no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I achieved, no matter how much of myself I gave up for them, I would never be enough. Not to parents who had already decided who mattered in this family. So I made a decision. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. I packed a single bag, took the little money I had saved from working part-time jobs, and I walked out of that house, out of their lives, without looking back. My parents didn't stop me. Why would they? They never really cared if I was there in the first place. I had nowhere to go, nowhere except Aunt Helen. She was my mother's older sister, but they barely spoke because my mother resented her. She used to call Aunt Helen opinionated, but I understood the real reason. Aunt Helen didn't tolerate bullshit. She was the only one who ever truly saw me. The only one who noticed when I was struggling. The only one who ever asked, "How are you, sweetheart?" and actually meant it. So when I showed up on her doorstep at midnight, my hands shaking, my breath uneven, my whole world crashing down around me, she didn't hesitate. She just let me in, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, a steaming cup of tea pressed into my hands. She sat me at the kitchen table, the familiar hum of the refrigerator grounding me in reality. The scent of warm food drifted from the stove as she reheated leftovers, insisting that I eat first. And when I did, when my stomach wasn't twisting in knots from the hunger and the heartbreak, I told her everything. How my parents had stolen my college fund, how they had spent it on Sienna's third wedding, how I had spent my entire life giving, sacrificing, waiting, only to realize I was nothing more than a disposable resource to them. How I had walked out of that house with nothing but a duffel bag and a shattered sense of self. Aunt Helen listened without interrupting, her fingers curled tightly around her coffee mug, knuckles turning white. The silence between us felt heavy, but it wasn't judgmental. It was the kind of silence that held understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with anger, but not at me. Never at me. She called them blind, selfish, too lost in their own twisted priorities to see the daughter who had done everything for them. And then, she said something no one had ever told me before. I was never the problem. And for the first time in my life, I believed her. The next morning, the exhaustion of the past years still clung to me. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was drowning. Aunt Helen sat across from me at the kitchen table, stirring her coffee. She looked at me like she was measuring her words carefully before finally speaking. She wanted to pay for my tuition. She said I deserved this chance. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. No one had ever offered me anything before. For a fleeting moment, I imagined how easy it would be. No more debt. No more struggling. No more exhaustion. But then came the familiar voices in my head. You're a burden. You don't deserve help. You have to do this on your own. The thought of relying on someone else, even someone who loved me, felt impossible. I had spent my whole life being used, being manipulated. If I accepted this, would it make me just like them? I swallowed down my pride, my voice shaking as I told her I couldn't accept it. But I asked if I could borrow it. Her expression was a mixture of concern and something else, something like pride. She knew I wouldn't let myself take the easy way out. She knew I needed to prove, to myself, not to anyone else, that I could do this. And so she agreed, not as a gift, but as a loan, because she believed in me. And for the first time in my life, so did I. Aunt Helen helped me find a way forward. She co-signed where I needed her to, helped me apply for grants, made sure I had what I needed, but never more than I could stand on my own. And I worked, extra shifts, late nights, no social life. I barely slept. I lived off cheap coffee and library hours. I felt like I was drowning half the time, but I made it through. I graduated with honors. I paid off every cent I borrowed from Aunt Helen within 2 years. And years later, when I was living in Los Angeles, working a job I had fought tooth and nail for, finally feeling free from my past, I got a phone call, a number I hadn't seen in years. My mother, and I should have ignored it. I wish I had. I never expected to hear from them again. For 8 years, I had built a life without them. A life where I didn't have to measure my worth by their approval. A life where I wasn't just an afterthought to Sienna's needs. And it was a good life. I had a career I was proud of, one that I had fought for, sacrificed for, and earned entirely on my own. I had a home that belonged to me, not something handed down by anyone else. I had financial security, stability, and most importantly, I had Alexander. Alexander, my husband, the man who showed me what unconditional love actually looked like. A man who never made me feel like I had to earn my place in his life. He had been the first person to truly see me, not as an extension of someone else, not as someone who existed to serve others, but as a person worthy of love just as I was. With him, I had built something real. We had our own traditions, our own holiday rituals. Christmas was ours, a time for just the two of us to celebrate the life we had created together, a life free from the chaos of my past. So when my phone lit up with a call from my mother just a few days before Christmas, I hesitated. Maybe I should have ignored it. Maybe I should have blocked the number, let it ring, let the past stay where it belonged. But I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that tiny, lingering part of me that still wanted to believe my parents could change. She sounded warm, almost emotional. She talked about the holidays, about family, about how time had gotten away from all of us. She told me she missed me, that they missed me, and like a fool, I let myself believe her. So I said yes. I said yes to coming home for Christmas, to giving them one last chance. I should have known better. The moment I stepped through the front door, I felt it. That wrongness. It wasn't the awkward tension of a family reunion. It wasn't the weight of old wounds reopening. It was something else. And then I saw them. Two children, a boy and a girl, sitting stiffly on the couch, their wide eyes darting between my parents and me. Finn and Ivy. I had never met them before, but I knew exactly who they were. Sienna's kids. And suddenly, everything made sense. The invitation, the warmth in my mother's voice, the sudden interest in seeing me again after nearly a decade of silence. They didn't want me back. They wanted me to fix Sienna's mess. Again, my mother wasted no time getting to the point. Sienna was going through a rough patch. She needed time to get back on her feet. And in the meantime, I was the obvious solution. Because I had a house, a husband, a stable job, because I owed it to family, because I was always the one expected to clean up after Sienna. I sat there, barely hearing their words, staring at the two children who had been placed in front of me like a problem to solve. Finn was 7, his small hands gripping the hem of his sweater. Ivy was 5, curled up against the armrest, her tiny fingers clutching a stuffed rabbit that looked as worn down as she did. They weren't wanted here. I could see it in the way my parents avoided looking at them. They were a burden, an inconvenience, a mistake that needed handling, and I was supposed to handle it. I almost laughed. After everything, after the stolen college fund, the years of neglect, the way they had made it abundantly clear that Sienna was the only child who mattered, they still thought they could demand this from me. They still thought I would say yes. But I wasn't the same desperate girl who had once begged for their approval. I had built a life without them. I had fought for every piece of happiness I had now. And I wasn't about to burn it all down for the sister who had never once lifted a finger for me. And yet, Finn's eyes flickered to mine, hesitant, unsure. Ivy curled in on herself, so small, so used to being ignored. They weren't to blame for this. They didn't ask for a mother who abandoned them. And yet, here they were, just like I had been, unwanted, disposable. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't going to let history repeat itself. Not this time. I'm not sure how long I stood there, frozen in the doorway, staring at the two small figures huddled on my porch. The wind howled through the streets of Los Angeles, an unnatural chill settling into my bones. Finn and Ivy stood motionless, their breath forming small clouds in the night air. They weren't wearing coats. Their shoes were thin. Their faces were pale, as if they'd been standing there for a while. And then I saw it, a crumpled piece of paper in Finn's tiny hand. Ivy clung to his side as he slowly, hesitantly, stretched out the note toward me. My fingers shook as I unfolded it, barely able to process the scrawled message staring back at me. "They're your problem now." I blinked. Read it again. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense, because no mother, not even Sienna, selfish and reckless as she was, would abandon her children like this, would she? But as I looked back at them, Finn, with his clenched jaw, trying to act braver than he felt, and Ivy, pressing her stuffed rabbit to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her together, I knew. She was gone. Sienna had really done it. At some point, my body moved on autopilot, pulling them inside, shutting the door against the cold. The warmth of the house barely seemed to reach them. They stood there, stiff, unsure, as if waiting for someone to yell that this was all a mistake. Finn didn't meet my eyes. His fingers twisted into the fabric of his sleeve, his shoulders curling inward. Ivy stayed silent, staring at the floor. Finally, Finn spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told me that Sienna had somewhere else to be, that she had dropped them off and driven away. Somewhere else to be, somewhere more important than her own children. Alexander appeared in the hallway, his face creased with concern. I barely had to say anything. He took one look at Finn and Ivy, at the way Ivy's small frame trembled from more than just the cold, and understood. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was abandonment. Ivy finally moved then, shifting slightly, so she was no longer pressed against Finn. Her lips parted like she was about to say something, but instead, a small, choked sob escaped her. And just like that, she collapsed into my arms. I caught her, holding her tiny, trembling body against mine as she broke down completely. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't a mother. I didn't know how to soothe a crying child. I didn't know the right words, but I held her anyway, my fingers running gently through her tangled hair, whispering, "It's okay. You're safe now." And I meant it, even if I had no idea what came next. The first call I made was to my parents, because surely, they wouldn't have allowed this. Surely they didn't know Sienna had abandoned them like this, right? Wrong. The second my mother answered, I could tell from her tone that she already knew. She sighed as if I were being dramatic, brushing off my panic. She acted as if this wasn't a big deal, as if this was some natural progression of events that I should have expected. When I told her that Sienna had left them with nothing, she simply said that I had my answer then. My answer? As if Sienna leaving them here was some kind of grand gesture of trust. As if this was planned, not a reckless act of selfishness. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I told her that Sienna hadn't given them to me. She had dumped them on my doorstep. She had abandoned them like an afterthought. My mother dismissed it. She insisted that the kids were better off with me anyway, that I had the means to care for them, that it wasn't her problem, that it had never been her problem. I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember what I said, if I said anything at all. All I remember is looking back at the two small figures curled up on my couch, Finn watching me carefully, Ivy still gripping my shirt like she was afraid I'd disappear too. I should have been angry. I should have resented them. I should have felt burdened by them. But all I felt was this overwhelming sense of clarity. Sienna wasn't coming back. My parents didn't care. There was no one else. So what kind of person would I be if I turned my back on them now? What kind of person would I be if I let them go through what I went through? If I let them feel unwanted the way I had? Ivy's breath hitched slightly as she clung to me, and I instinctively ran my hand through her hair again. Finn, silent, stoic Finn, watched me carefully, his eyes flickering with something hesitant, like he wanted to believe I was different, like he needed me to be different. So I made a decision. I wasn't their mother. I didn't know the first thing about raising kids, but I knew what it felt like to be unwanted, and I knew I wouldn't let them feel that way ever again. I should have known Sienna wouldn't stay gone forever. People like her never do. At first, it was almost peaceful. The first few weeks with Finn and Ivy were hard, so much harder than I expected, but Alexander and I were figuring it out. The kids started to settle in, their small shoulders finally relaxing, as if realizing they were safe. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but the message was short and direct. "She's back." For a second, I had no idea who it meant. Then my stomach dropped. Sienna. She didn't show up at my house right away. No, that would have been too direct. Instead, she started weaving her way around me, circling my life like a vulture waiting for the right moment to strike. It began with the neighbors. Mrs. Callahan, the sweet old woman who lived next door, caught me one morning as I was leaving for work. Her expression was tight, concerned. She told me she had seen a young woman hanging around my house. A blonde woman. A woman who looked an awful lot like me. She had been showing up when I wasn't home. She had been talking to Alexander. She had been inside my house. I don't know what I expected when I got home that evening. Maybe some kind of reasonable explanation. Maybe that it was all a misunderstanding. Instead, the second I stepped inside, I found Alexander standing at the kitchen counter, his expression carefully neutral, his hands gripping a coffee mug just a little too tightly. Before I could ask, he spoke first. He told me that Sienna had stopped by, that she had shown up at my doorstep, ringing the bell like she had every right to be there, claiming she just wanted to check on her kids, that she had made herself comfortable, that she had worn a dress that barely covered anything, that she had laughed too sweetly, leaned too close, and touched his arm just a little too often, that she had mentioned how lonely she was, how hard things had been, how she just needed someone to talk to. And then, he hesitated, She had asked if he was happy with me, if he ever wondered what it would be like to be with someone less uptight, someone who knew how to have fun, someone like her. My mind went blank. I knew Sienna was selfish. I knew she was reckless, irresponsible, cruel. But this, trying to sink her claws into my husband, it was another level of shameless. And the worst part? She hadn't even tried to hide it. I saw her the next day. She was standing in my driveway when I got home, her arms crossed, her lips curled into a smirk. She acted like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just tried to ruin my marriage, like I was overreacting. And when I confronted her, when I demanded to know what the hell she thought she was doing, she laughed. She told me that if I wasn't going to take care of her, then maybe Alexander would. That if I wasn't willing to help her financially, she could always find someone else who would. That he was too good for me anyway. That maybe he deserved someone more fun, more easygoing, more like her. I saw red. I told her to get off my property. I told her she wasn't welcome near my house, near my husband, near my family ever again. She only tilted her head, smiled, and told me we'd see about that. Then she walked away like she had already won, like she thought she still had some kind of control over me, like she thought she could destroy my life just because she had failed at hers. But this time, I wasn't playing her game. This time, I was going to win. It wasn't just disgust anymore. It was rage. The kind that burns deep and leaves scars. Alexander had been patient, too patient, but Sienna had finally crossed a line he would not tolerate. He wasn't the kind of man to raise his voice easily, but when he did, it was like thunder. That day, when she dropped by, yet again, dressed like she was going clubbing, making flimsy excuses to be alone with him, he had enough. He didn't even wait for me to step in. His voice boomed through the house, cutting through her fake innocence. He told her, with absolute finality, that whatever game she thought she was playing, it was over. That she was a pathetic excuse for a mother, and she should be ashamed for abandoning Finn and Ivy. That she disgusted him. She didn't even have the dignity to be embarrassed. Just smirked, flipped her hair, and sauntered off like she had won something. I thought that would be the last time I saw her. That she would finally slink away in shame. But I was wrong. Sienna was out of our lives. But something didn't sit right with me. A few weeks later, I took Finn and Ivy in for a routine doctor's appointment. Just something simple, checking their nutrition, making sure they were adjusting well. It was all going fine until the doctor casually mentioned blood types. I hadn't really thought about it before. But when the doctor said Finn was AB+ and Ivy was O-, something inside me clicked. Sienna was type A. And both of her ex-husbands were type A as well. It wasn't possible. I felt my stomach turn. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it. That maybe there was some rare genetic exception I didn't know about. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. That night, after Finn and Ivy went to bed, I sat in my office, staring at my laptop, researching blood type inheritance patterns. Over and over, the same conclusion stared back at me. There was no way these kids were biologically hers. I tried to rationalize. Maybe she had an affair. Maybe she didn't even know. But deep down, I already knew the answer. Sienna was a liar. And if there was a way to scam a system, she would find it. So I did what I had to do. I took strands of hair from Finn's old hoodie, a toothbrush Ivy had left in the bathroom, and sent them for DNA testing. A week later, the results came in. Sienna was not their mother. I felt like I was going to throw up. My hands shook as I gripped the paper, rereading the words over and over, hoping I was wrong. But I wasn't. The truth was right there in cold, hard science. Finn and Ivy had no biological connection to her at all. I didn't know what to do at first. Who were their real parents? Did they even know their kids were gone? But more than anything, I couldn't shake the horror of what this meant. Sienna had never loved them. Not even for a second. They were never her children. She had been using them. And now, I had proof. I confronted her 2 days later. She showed up at my house again, like she still had some kind of claim here. I didn't even let her step inside. I just held out the envelope. She looked at it, then at me, and rolled her eyes. "What's this?" "I got a DNA test done," I said, my voice steady. "Finn and Ivy aren't your children." I expected shock, denial, some kind of reaction, but all she did was smirk. "Took you long enough," she said. My blood ran cold. She wasn't even surprised. She knew. She had always known. And she wasn't ashamed. I could barely form words. You knew this whole time?" She shrugged. "Of course. You think I'm stupid." I felt sick. "Then why? Why take them?" Her smirk widened. "Why do you think, genius?" "Money." I felt the ground beneath me tilt. She didn't even try to sugarcoat it. She admitted, without hesitation, that she had adopted them through shady means, just so she could collect government assistance, charity donations, and benefits meant for struggling single mothers. She never cared about them. They were just a paycheck. She said it like it was nothing. Like she was telling me the weather. My heart pounded in my chest as she kept talking. And you know the best part? She said, her voice dripping with amusement. You fell for it too. I wanted to scream. She tilted her head, eyes glinting with satisfaction. You love them now, don't you? Which means you won't let them go. So congratulations, sis. Looks like you just adopted 2 kids. I couldn't breathe. She was right about one thing. I did love them, and she was using that against me. But what she didn't realize, I wasn't the weak, naive girl she had grown up manipulating. She thought she had won. She thought she had trapped me. But she had made a critical mistake. She had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect Finn and Ivy. And she was about to find out just how badly she had miscalculated. I wasn't sure what kind of reaction I expected when I walked into the police station that day. Maybe a part of me still thought this would feel like a mistake, like I was betraying my own family. But I knew better. Sienna had made her choice. And now, it was time she faced the consequences. With a deep breath, I handed over the DNA results, the records of financial fraud, and the proof of government assistance fraud to the officer at the desk. My fingers felt ice cold, my grip tightening around the papers as I forced myself to breathe steadily. It took them less than 48 hours to build a case against her. When they finally came to arrest her, she didn't even try to deny it. She just screamed. The sound of sirens filled the street outside my house as I stood at the front door, arms wrapped around Finn and Ivy, shielding them from the chaos. Sienna stood on the porch, handcuffs clicking around her wrists as 2 officers held her in place. She thrashed, her eyes wild, her hair disheveled, fighting against them as though the force of her own will could change what was happening. She kept shouting that this was a mistake, that they couldn't take her kids away from her. But the words rang hollow because even Finn, standing beside me, didn't flinch. His small hand clung to mine, his grip steady in a way that no child should have to learn. I watched as Sienna's face twisted, flickering between fury and desperation, before she turned to me. The venom in her voice was unmistakable, blaming me for ruining her life. But I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel anger. I only felt exhaustion. For so many years, I had carried the weight of my family's expectations, their betrayals, their selfishness. And yet, here Sienna was, acting as if I had been the one who did this to her, as if none of this had been her own doing. But this time, I wasn't going to shoulder the blame. The officers shoved her into the back of the police car as she kept screaming, her voice fading as they drove away. And just like that, Sienna was gone. I should have known my parents would come next. They arrived before the police cars had even fully disappeared, storming up my driveway as if they were the ones who had been wronged. Denise had tears in her eyes, but I had seen this act before. She only cried when it suited her, when it benefited her. She threw herself at my feet, clutching at my wrists, nails digging into my skin like a woman in mourning. She kept saying that I couldn't do this to my own sister. That family was all we had left. But I knew what she really meant. It was never about Sienna. It was never about family. It was about control. About keeping the illusion that they could always twist the situation in their favor, no matter how badly they had treated me in the past. And Franklin? He wasn't crying. He wasn't begging. He was seething. His face had turned red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his voice shaking with fury as he practically spat out his final ultimatum. If I let this happen, then I was no longer his daughter. A long time ago, those words would have crushed me. But now, they felt like a release. I met his gaze, holding it with the same icy composure I had spent years building in boardrooms filled with men who never took me seriously. I had fought my way to success without their help. I had built my life without their approval. I didn't need their love. I simply turned my back on them and walked inside, shutting the door in their faces. For the first time in my life, I felt nothing but freedom. 2 days later, I got the call from social services. Because Sienna was facing felony charges, the state needed to determine the future of Finn and Ivy. And the first people they contacted? My parents. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought, maybe this would be it. Maybe, for the first time, they would step up. Maybe they would finally take responsibility. But I should have known better. The moment they were asked, they refused. They didn't even hesitate. They stated they were too old to care for young children, that it wasn't their responsibility. And, of course, they immediately suggested that I take them instead. I shouldn't have been surprised. I wasn't surprised. But it still hurt. Even now, after everything, they still couldn't be bothered. They didn't care about Finn and Ivy. They didn't care about Sienna. They only cared about themselves. That was when I finally understood the full depth of it. There was never going to be a moment when my parents changed. There was never going to be a day where they finally loved me the way I had spent my whole life hoping they would. They had made their choice. And now, I was making mine. Finn and Ivy had no one else. But that was okay, because unlike my parents, I wasn't a coward. Unlike them, I wasn't going to turn my back on these kids. Unlike them, I actually gave a damn. So when the social worker asked what I wanted to do, I already knew the answer. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and said, "What do I have to do to adopt them?" I never thought I would see my own sister sitting in a defendant's chair, clad in an orange jumpsuit, staring at the judge with barely concealed resentment. I never thought I would be standing in a courtroom, fighting for two children who weren't even biologically related to me, but who had become my entire world. Yet here we were. The legal battle for Finn and Ivy wasn't just about getting custody. It was about making sure they would never have to live in fear again. It was about proving, once and for all, that Sienna had never deserved them in the first place. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of shuffling papers and the occasional murmur from the lawyers. Alexander was by my side, his presence grounding me. He had been my rock through all of this, reading through legal documents late at night, making sure I ate when stress took my appetite away, reassuring me every time doubt tried to creep in. When the judge asked if I was ready to proceed, Alexander squeezed my hand under the table. I was ready. Our lawyers started by laying everything out: the financial fraud, the abandoned children, the fake government claims. Every detail was presented with cold, undeniable truth. The evidence spoke for itself. Sienna had never cared for Finn and Ivy. She had only used them as pawns in her selfish game. And when the social workers testified about the trauma the kids had endured, about how Finn had taken on the role of a parent before he had even lost all his baby teeth, something inside me shattered all over again. But Sienna, she sat there, stone-faced, as if she were simply waiting for all of this to be over, as if she didn't care. Then came the hardest part. Finn and Ivy had to testify. They were led to the stand, Finn holding Ivy's hand tightly, his small frame stiff with nerves. When he was asked about the night they were left on my doorstep, his voice was steady but hollow. He talked about how long they had waited, how they had knocked and knocked until their hands were sore, how Ivy had cried herself to sleep sitting against the door. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached. And then, when Finn was asked what he wanted, to stay with me or go back to his mother, he hesitated for only a second before looking straight at the judge. He said he never wanted to go back. He said he didn't have a mother. He said he only had me. I wiped away tears that I hadn't even realized were falling. Sienna had her chance to speak. She played the victim like she always did, blaming stress, blaming finances, blaming the world for the choices she had made. She claimed she had been overwhelmed, that she had planned to return, that this was all a misunderstanding. She even had the audacity to act as if I had manipulated the situation. But the evidence was undeniable. The judge didn't believe her. No one did. When the final verdict was read, my whole body felt like it was floating. Custody of Finn and Ivy was officially granted to me. Sienna's parental rights were terminated. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and child abandonment. And my parents? They weren't even in the courtroom when the decision was made. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. I knelt down to Finn and Ivy's level, unsure how to even put into words what had just happened. But I didn't have to. Finn understood. He took a deep breath, his small hands trembling, and asked a question that nearly broke me. "Can we stay with you forever?" His voice was quiet, but his eyes were desperate, pleading, begging me to promise something that no child should ever have to ask. I pulled them both into my arms, holding them as tightly as I could, as if I could somehow make up for every moment of uncertainty they had endured. "Yes," I whispered. "Forever." For the first time, Finn finally let himself cry, and I held him, rocking him gently, as Ivy curled against my chest, her tiny fingers clutching my shirt. They were safe now. They were home. Sienna was gone. My parents were gone. And yet, standing there, with Alexander's arm around my shoulder and two children holding on to me like I was the only thing keeping them grounded, I didn't feel like I had lost anything at all. I had won. And for the first time in my life, I had a family that was worth fighting for. A year has passed since that day in court. A year since I stood in front of a judge, holding my breath, waiting for someone else to decide what I had already known in my heart. Finn and Ivy were mine. Now it's official. I am their mother, not just in the way I tucked them into bed at night, or how I held them when they had nightmares. Not just in the way I sat with Finn through his first real math test, or how I let Ivy pick out the color of her new bedroom walls. Legally, officially, undeniably, my name is on their birth certificates now. And Sienna, she's still behind bars. My parents, they tried to call, tried to email, even sent a few handwritten letters full of flowery words about family and forgiveness. I never responded, because the truth is, I don't care. They are nothing more than a closed chapter in my life. A book I put back on the shelf and will never reopen. Instead, I packed up my life, took my husband's hand, and moved forward. Alexander, Finn, Ivy, and I left Denver behind. We settled in Los Angeles, where no one knew us as the girl who was always overlooked, or the boy who had to raise his sister, or the little girl who had been tossed aside like an afterthought. Here, we are simply a family, a real one, and that's all that matters. This story was originally shared on our /True Off My Chest, where thousands of people resonated with Savannah's journey. But what do you think? Would you have forgiven them? Would you have walked away? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more real-life stories filled with heartbreak, redemption, and unexpected twists, make sure to subscribe to Reddit True Vault, because sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.